Laura, working on the basis that there is no newscast tradition not worth reviving.
What's that? That makes me really worried.
Foodstuffs. The return, because cake was a big thing for us, wasn't it, during the Brexit years?
It was.
And now, croissants.
Yeah, and it's... Oh, you are actually eating on the telly.
Eat on the telly, which,
Blimey.
if Ed Miliband was here, would tell me was not advisable.
Is that a plant-based croissant or a normal butter-based croissant? Because I've been learning all about the difference.
Well, this is where your expertise is going to be lent upon, Adam. It is a butter-based croissant, I'm dutifully told.
What are you talking about, Adam?
So basically the greatest piece of investigative journalism I've done my entire career was here at COP26,
Right.
the climate change conference in Glasgow.
Yes.
I was going for breakfast one morning. Oh, this has reached legendary status already. And we've already talked about it on the podcast on BBC Sounds this week. But now here's the TV version with added pictures of Chris Mason eating a croissant in case you didn't know what one looked like. And I was surprised to find out that a plant-based croissant had a bigger carbon footprint than a bacon roll. And of course that seems a bit counterintuitive because we're always being told one of the things you can do to help reduce greenhouse gases is eat less meat. So of course that went on social media. Farmers loved it because they said, this shows that we're not the bad guys. But it turns out it was wrong. They put on the carbon footprint for the wrong kind of croissant. They put on the carbon footprint of the kind of croissant you're eating now, Chris, a butter one, which is full of dairy. And it turns out that a true plant-based croissant has a fifth the carbon footprint of a normal one.
Well,
but then,
now
of course,
we've
it got even
established
weirder
that.
because then it caused an international incident because then I bumped into the French ecological transition minister and she told French people to eat fewer croissants.
That is just the sort of minister you would bump into, Adam, somehow.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Chris in the studio.
It's Laura in the studio with now 1.5 croissants for those people who are listening rather than watching.
And it's Adam in the Riverside studio in front of the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow.
Hooray!
And we've got loads of coppery to get to beyond croissants, vegan or otherwise. But Laura, quite a bit of stuff going on at Westminster in the last 24 hours, and particularly today, Thursday, with kind of developments hour by hour around, well, not just Owen Paterson, one particular backbencher former cabinet minister, although he is at the centre of this, but the whole business of how MPs, how their behaviour is regulated. But bigger than that, what people looking in on this place make of it.
Absolutely. So if you've been living under a rock, I will try and do the short version. Owen Paterson was a Tory cabinet minister, very long-serving MP. He was found to have broken the lobbying rules more than a dozen times by talking to the government about various issues when he was on the payroll of 2 companies. Now, the report into him, the Standards Committee did, was very, very clear that he had really done the wrong thing. He has always insisted that he was innocent and he was acting in the public interest. But the Standards Committee, which is in charge of making sure MPs don't do naughty things, recommended that he should be suspended for 30 days. Parliament was going to have to vote on that. But instead of having a vote on that yesterday, the Tories came up with a plan to overhaul the rules that he'd been found guilty of, which would have protected him and torn up the rule book, basically. Now, that vote squeaked through last night by 18, which when you've got a majority of 80, that tells you something's wrong. But there was a furious backlash. Lots of Tories were outraged. Front pages were appalling for the Conservatives this morning. And it became very clear that the opposition parties wouldn't work with the government on creating this new system. So they ditched it, screeching U-turn. And then Owen Paterson has now quit. And it is a mess. It backfired spectacularly. And it's really raised this issue again of sleaze. And it's also stirred up all those questions about the Prime Minister's own attitude to following the rules.
We should hear, shouldn't we, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Leader of the Commons, in the chamber this morning, doing the bit that if you could put a soundtrack to is the handbrake being pulled, the tyres smoking and the car completely changing direction.
I fear last night's debate conflated the individual case with the general concern. This link needs to be broken. Therefore, I and others will be looking to work on a cross-party basis to achieve improvements in our system for future cases.
I think the chances of there now being a cross-party consensus on this are dead as a dodo.
Even though the government's done its thing?
I think so, yeah, I think so. And instead of saying, yes, let's look at the new system, you've actually now got the opposition parties very strongly reacting to this. And I had a chat earlier with Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, who says this is nothing less than corruption.
What they've done is corrupt. And often in a situation like this, you have a prime minister who is trying to lead on public standards. What you've got with this prime minister is a prime minister who is leading his troops through the sewer. And so it is a complete mess of their own making.
It's a very strong accusation to say this is corrupt.
Well, it is corrupt because there was a clear finding after due process about Owen Paterson engaging in paid lobbying. That's been outlawed rightly in Parliament for many, many years. So there's a clear finding, and then to rip the whole system up to protect him is corrupt. There's no point shilly-shallying around and pretending it's something else. It's corruption. And on this occasion, it's corruption from the top, from the Prime Minister down, because he whipped his MPs to vote to bring down the entire standards system. And it has very wide implications for politics, for standards in public life in the United Kingdom that go well beyond this individual case.
There are two bits of all of this that I found quite intriguing watching this from a distance. Hearing Jacob Rees-Mogg there saying, in the debate, the two things got conflated, the system and the individual. Actually, if you read the amendment that kicked this all off by the MPs led by Andrea Leadsom, it actually explicitly listed the two things on the same motion. And the second thing is that when this all first emerged, it looked like it was a sort of backbench initiative by some concerned Conservative MPs, and then it very quickly became clear this was a really orchestrated, organised thing that people like the Chief Whip had been making phone calls about, and it was really planned and executed. But I wanted to ask you two about just the conspiracy theories that actually the change to the system was designed basically to just save one man, Owen Paterson, theory number one, and theory number two, that it's not necessarily about the system, it's about the woman who runs the system at the moment, the Independent Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone. What do you make of those two conspiracy theories?
Well, I think it's absolutely true to say there is no love lost between Downing Street and Catherine Stone, who's the Independent Commissioner for Standards. That is absolutely the case. It was suggested to me that somehow Boris Johnson has got a real animus towards her because she found that his behaviour had not been absolutely as it should have been over that holiday to Mystique. In fairness, we should always say Boris Johnson would say they'd done nothing wrong, and Downing Street have said they genuinely were trying to look at reforming the system here because there's a widespread view that it doesn't work that well. But I think this is clearly about more than one person. And now tonight in Westminster, there are fingers being pointed at the Chief Whip. But do you want to know the anatomy of how it's been described to me of exactly what happened?
Should we do that after we've heard from Owen Paterson and
Yes.
that statement, just so we see what he's saying tonight
Absolutely.
before we unpick exactly kind of where we are and what you're hearing? We haven't heard from Owen Paterson in front of cameras or in front of microphones, but he put out a written statement which we can bring you a little bit of. He says, "I maintain that I'm totally innocent of what I've been accused of, and I acted at all times in the interests of public health and safety. Far, far worse than having my honesty questioned was, of course, the suicide of my beloved and wonderful wife, Rose. Worst of all was seeing people, including MPs, publicly mock and deride Rose's death and belittle our pain. I will remain a public servant, but outside the cruel world of politics." A reference there to his late wife, Rose, who took her own life last year.
And he was clear previously when this finding happened that one of the reasons why she had become extremely distressed was the whole process and how long the investigation dragged on, and that she had found it very, very distressing indeed. But I think that strength of feeling from Owen Paterson and among his backers and his friends who were sort of looking for a way out, I think that sort of came together with, as has been suggested to me, a concern in Number 10 about how this system worked. What I understand happened was that the Chief Whip, Mark Spencer, was basically given an instruction. Well, I was told he was set a target of finding a way of reforming the standard system and protecting Owen Paterson. He then phoned John Whittingdale, friend of Newscast, former Conservative cabinet minister, to say, look, we've got this idea about changing the system. Would you be prepared to do it? He then said, well, I don't particularly fancy it, but yes, okay, I'm being asked to do something. He believes also there is some concern about the way the process worked. Andrea Leadsom, another former cabinet minister, and they're all sort of a group, Brett Steers, former ministers, same kind of era. She put her name down then to the amendment, the way that they were going to try and make this happen in Parliament. But of course, then when suddenly what happened in Parliament last night with cries of shame, one Labour MP calling, "What have you done to this place?" Furious backlash in all the papers. Suddenly Downing Street goes, screeching U-turn. And John Whittingdale and other people who are involved are thinking, well, hang on a minute. You guys were
dry, basically.
Yeah, and as a result, Owen Paterson then felt, well, what will probably happen next week is there would have been a vote in Parliament. He would have been suspended. And instead, what we're looking at is a by-election. And I don't think for a second that the opposition parties are going to leave this alone. And we've already seen, haven't we, Chris, from opposition parties, particularly online, not just Starmer sitting down and talking to me, online, this is absolutely now going to be used in attack ads against Conservative MPs, particularly in marginals. And some MPs that I was talking to today were just sort of saying, my goodness, we were pressured to do this. Now we went out, we took the hit, and now it's all this terrible mess. And we can probably have a look at some of the ads that are already on social media, doing the rounds.
Yeah, there's one from Labour. Tory MP James Morris voted to save one of his mates who broke the rules. One rule for them, another rule for everyone else. That a reference to the MP for Halesowen and Rowley Regis in the West Midlands, who did as he was asked to yesterday by voting with the government. Labour seizing on that. Lib Dems up to exactly the same thing with an ad featuring Owen Paterson and the Prime Minister. It's one rule for you, no rules for them. And that's the key thing, isn't it? At the heart of all of this, because there's a huge amount of detail, a lot of which will leave plenty of people cold, is just that sense, that most damaging of senses of MPs looking after themselves and detached from broader reality and being governed in a way or having a set of rules that are a million miles away, as some might see it, from a conventional workplace.
That's right. And very quickly, when you talk to Labour people at the moment, they say one of the things that works for them in focus groups is this notion that they've been trying very hard to create, whether that's about PPE contracts or all sorts of other things. They believe that that attack line about one rule for everybody else and then another rule for Tory cronies, as they might describe it, they think that is starting to cut through. Now, maybe that is more in hope than reality, because it is also the case there's a lot of Tories who just think this stuff doesn't cut through. Boris Johnson's the kind of politician people know that he's made a career out of giving this impression that, well, he doesn't always do exactly the right thing, but so what? Of course, Downing Street would say, obviously, he hasn't done anything wrong. But, they think in a way, somehow they're maybe immune from this stuff, but the opposition parties are starting to question that case. And, Adam, I think it's made some politicians feel quite awkward, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. And it's been felt up here in Glasgow, hundreds of miles away, because obviously it's a huge news story and you can't ignore it. And there are quite a lot of Conservative MPs here because they've got interests in what's happening in COP, and some of them are really quite scathing about it as well. So the Westminster gossip's been in the air here. And also you've got ministers here. And also you've got other government business here that is potentially being overshadowed by this. So there was a huge announcement about phasing out coal power today, which is one of Boris Johnson's big COP priorities. But Alok Sharma, the COP president's press conference, I asked him about Owen Paterson, and the business secretary Kwasi Kwarteng is here, and when I bumped into him in the corridor, I didn't ask him about some nerdy coal stats. I asked him about some comments he'd made about the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards.
Kwasi, do you still stand by your comments about the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards? Do you think she should stay in post? Do you still think the Commissioner's going to have a difficult time staying in post?
Well, that was informative, wasn't it? But just to prove that it feels like the entire world is here, I'm now joined in this beautiful riverside location because I've been joined by former Home Secretary, former Work and Pension Secretary, and crucially, former Energy Secretary at the time of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, Amber Rudd.
Thank you, Chris. And former Women and Equalities Minister.
I'm Adam, you got me mixed up with Chris.
Sorry. Thank you, Adam, and former Women and Equalities Minister, just to round it off.
Okay, because everyone, that's
the
always
whole
an important plum job that no one forgets.
It is to me.
Yes. Now, we'll talk about your specialist subject, which is this, COP26 in a second. But, I mean, what's your reaction to what's been happening with Owen Paterson, with the U-turn, with the attempt to change the standard system?
Well, I mean, I've watched it with growing horror, really, and sadness. I mean, Owen Paterson has had, if he just accepted the situation, as far as I can see from the distance here, he could have had choices going forward. And today we've learnt that he has decided to resign as an MP altogether. So I think he has been poorly advised after doing some things which I don't know the details of, but I mean, he was clearly been found wanting in many different ways. And I wish he had just accepted that rather than perhaps being encouraged by his friends to challenge it in this way.
Amber, one of your famous lines from back in the Brexit argument days when you were on the TV with the Prime Minister, the now Prime Minister on the other side, was to describe him as the life and soul of the party, but he's not the man you want to drive you home at the end of the evening, with a clear barb ultimately about trust. And this whole thing boils down to trust, doesn't it? And the potential for people simply not having it in politics as a result of what's gone on.
Yeah, that could be the consequence. And it's a great shame because, as we often say, the vast majority of politicians are trustworthy, good people. They try hard and they often have a very difficult time. And I must say, having seen Owen's resignation letter, the bit that really stuck with me is his reference to his family. It is fairly unusual as a career that your whole family have to take the consequences with you in quite such a way.
But Amber, was it right, though, for Number 10 and the Tory party to try to rip up the rules?
No, it wasn't right. And I wouldn't have supported it if I had been there. I think it was a misjudgment of an epic and sort of, in a way, baffling proportion, because the U-turn was swift because the consequence was enormous, and rightly so.
Now, one of the jobs that you do now that you're out of Parliament, some people would call lobbying. You would probably call public affairs or consultancy or something like that. Now that you know more about that world, do you think that is compatible with being an MP at the same time as well? Could you do both those things?
No, first of all, I don't do lobbying.
No, okay, so I'm happy to be corrected.
But
I thought you did do something. You did something sort of public affairs.
Yes, but I don't. I never engage with government. I only speak to businesses.
Oh well, that's interesting because we just sort of label it all as one thing, and actually you would say there's very different things.
I think there is, because lobbying's about, do you contact government ministers or MPs or select committees or whatever it is, and the answer is no. I don't think it is consistent with that. It is difficult for MPs to have alternative jobs, but I think there are some they can do. But the business of actually lobbying a minister on behalf of someone you are paid by is rightly not allowed.
Right, onto your specialist subject, climate change and what we're doing about it. You were there in Paris for the Paris Climate Change Agreement. I don't know how widely understood that document actually is.
It was the first ever global agreement, 195 countries setting out their plans to limit the dangerous impact of climate change and to reduce emissions. And that's why Paris was so distinct from Glasgow and was so extraordinary at the time. We actually got one agreement signed by 195 countries.
And the headline figure was about limiting the increase in global temperatures by the end of this century to 2 degrees. But then you were saying that actually they snuck in this other one.
Yes, that's right. On the front of the document itself, it was always about 2 degrees. And then at the very last moment, the final weekend, when we were all absolutely exhausted, and about 4 a.m, another text came out. And the French had cut off the coffee, let alone the food. The sort of building was being dismantled around us. This 1.5 degrees appeared, and to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And it was really the small island states who pushed on that. A fantastic man called Tony de Broom from the Marshall Islands, who's sadly no longer with us. And the UK and the EU were very keen on a much more ambitious agreement than the US and China, which is why China's now slightly pushing back on the idea that 1.5 degrees is the real text and ambition. It was going to be 2 degrees. But it's a really good news that since Paris, people have basically become more ambitious. And, we can look around us and see why. You see the evidence of climate change with the droughts and the floods. So people want a more ambitious progress than was originally envisaged.
And Amber, it's Laura here. Hello, thank you for coming and joining us
Laura.
tonight. Hello. If people haven't been following this, because there's been a real flurry of stuff emerging from Glasgow at the beginning of this week, but if people aren't following the ins and outs of it, in as simple terms as you can, what difference do you think this big jamboree in my wonderful home city is actually going to make.
Well, there are two things, I think, that are really important about these 2 weeks. The first one is the fact that it is the forcing mechanism that everyone talks about. So when you say different countries, different companies, different stakeholders, we're going to do our best, we're going to do this, we might announce that, this is the time they have to do it by, and everybody's watching. So that's the really good news. And the second thing about this is that people are getting into groups to make those announcements. So you have groups of corporates agreeing to net zero or certain transparency rules. You have groups of countries, like we just had this morning, who make ambitious commitments to reducing or coming off coal altogether. So it's an effective way of getting people to be more ambitious while there's so much pressure on them since we're all here. So I know there's a kind of element of, oh my goodness, what is this? It's just a whole lot of people coming together. And there is a kind of fun element to it, different age groups, different nationalities.
That's
different
quote,
croissants.
unquote fun.
Yeah, different croissants, of course. But there is also a very serious bit that there are real announcements coming, real information being exchanged. And the feeling is quite excited, quite optimistic.
How do we work out, though, Amber, at the end of it, whether it's been a success or not?
Well, we had the same problem in Paris, really, because even though it was likely we felt that we would get an agreement in Paris, it wasn't necessarily likely that we would get an ambitious agreement, one where the green lobbies would say, yes, this is something that we can be proud of, that we can work towards. And really, it's a very good question. Who are the arbiters of whether this works or doesn't? Particularly as this is more like a sort of conductor bringing together an orchestra with different parts, trying to get one orchestra, one tune out of it. But I think that all the green organisations around us are watching it very carefully. I mean, today, for instance, the IEA, which is run by Fatih Birol, the International Energy Association, which has been really concerned about the lack of activity, said the announcements so far mean that we might get just under 2 degrees by the end of this century, which is quite a good achievement so far, because the general evidence is that whatever is announced and acted on, don't forget, acted on has to follow announcements, is that the assistance with the technology and the movement by the public means that accelerates. So it's good news. This looks like it's going to be better than perhaps people thought.
But that's a really good question, Chris, because I'm turning my thoughts to what's it going to be like at the end of next week when the 13 or 14 days of negotiations end. And you talk to the negotiators and say, what are you going to be discussing for the last week? And they say things like, oh, you know that 100 billion that was promised from rich countries to poorer countries to help them with the transition to green, that's meant to run out in 2025. We need to start talking about what will the process be for deciding what the next round of funding is going to be for the next 5 years. Oh, and we need to look at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where we work out what are the legalities of the carbon permit market going to be. And we also need to work out, how do we calculate the different risk premiums for people building a climate resilient bridge? And you think, you know what? That does not lead me to think there's going to be some kind of like Olympic-style closing ceremony for Boris Johnson to come and do the Spice Girls at the end of next week. So, Amber, are you not worried that this will end actually with a bit of a whimper, having started with quite a big bang with all those leaders here?
No, because I think that, I mean, something could go wrong, of course, but at the moment...
Oh, yeah, there's that too. It might not even be boring. It might be bad.
But it feels like there is momentum going in the right direction. I don't think there is going to be an Olympic-style ceremony like there was in Paris with Laurent Fabius with his gavel poised when actually Ecuador stopped the whole thing, saying we don't believe in markets, we're Marxists. So we had to redo it a bit. Ecuador, always creating trouble. But so I don't think there will be that. But people will have their own way of looking at this to see if there's a success. But if you get people like the IEA saying this is good, we're on track for under 2 degrees, if you get people like the big green organisations saying, you know, we're not there yet, but this is the right ambition, then there will be evidence that we can say that this is a success, but it's not an opportunity to stop. It's just an opportunity to accelerate. But can I just say, my own thing that I will be looking for is sufficient evidence that the markets, the money, is really going to continue to fund renewables and carbon capture and storage and all the good things that need to industrialise countries in a green way. And I think that a lot of the potential investors are looking at this saying, are there sufficient signals for us? Can we really rely on a new green industrial revolution? And I think that confidence could really create a momentum for investment that would be really helpful.
Can I just ask you a few domestic questions?
Yes.
If you look at all these strategies that the government's come out with in the build-up to this conference, which they basically had to do, because if you're going to host this conference, you have to be greener than green. Nowhere does it say, I as an individual will have to do anything different. Is that credible? Is that realistic?
I think that there is an awareness that this green industrial revolution, as the Prime Minister calls it, is going to have certain costs. And we're beginning to see from Rishi's last budget and his spending review that where he's going to get that. But I think that the public kind of know that there's going to be changes. But I do think it's not unreasonably a delicate balance for politicians here. I mean, they want to make sure that they set the framework to get the outcome that we all want, with lower carbon emissions, but nor do they want to kind of scare the horses. I mean, there's a famous phrase I sometimes refer to, which is politicians know what to do, they just don't know how to get re-elected after they've done it.
Yeah.
So we need to be careful to take everybody with us.
But I mean, would you be comfortable if you were a cabinet minister now? Well, would you be comfortable if you were a cabinet minister now? Full stop. But if you were a cabinet minister now,
possibly not, given who the Prime Minister is.
Yeah, and especially if he's offering you a lift, famously, and saying to people, "Oh, you need to eat less meat." Actually, you need to go for the vegan croissant, which doesn't taste as nice as the bacon sandwich, because the scientists say we're going to have to eat less meat. Would you be comfortable recommending to people that that's what they do?
No, I wouldn't.
But would you do it nonetheless?
But I do. I mean, listen, when I was growing up, there was one vegetarian restaurant around. It was called Cranks. That's what people thought of people who are vegetarians. I'm so sorry.
We were patrons.
And now it's everywhere. And I hadn't considered my political career then, I have to. Last night I was at one of those nice dinners, and I looked around, and the man on my left and the man on my right, they were both having the vegetarian option.
What were you
And
having?
it actually looked a bit nicer than mine.
Oh, what were you
So
having?
I
Rare
may just go
steak.
vegetarian because there's so much. No, it wasn't quite, but I don't think I'm going to confess what it was. But I
Venison.
think having the vegetarian option,
Bambi.
like having the green energy, is going to turn out to be the better thing, not just the right thing.
Amber, whilst I ponder what may or may not have been on your dinner plate last night, let's talk about the Prime Minister. You know him well from being in government and the Brexit debates and all the rest of it. Let's talk about all things Boris Johnson and green. Because he sounds like the greenest man since the last green activist you bumped into.
The Hulk.
Yeah, and
Swamp.
he hasn't always been like that.
No, he hasn't. He has the zeal of the convert, and it's great because those of us who really do want this to happen and have been talking about it for a while, we can just welcome it. You can sound a bit baffled sometimes, but the fact is, I think he has decided that this is Johnsonianism. It is the big green industrial revolution. It is delivering new jobs, new opportunities, new technology in the seats perhaps that don't have those sort of opportunities, particularly outside of London. And it is an opportunity for UK leadership, since the rest of the world is also going to be adopting this new green industrial revolution. So it really ticks a lot of his boxes. And so he's fervent about it, and amen to that.
Right, I'm going to go to bed now because I've got to get up early tomorrow, because I'm told we're going to get one of the first kind of good assessments of how successful COP has been already, because some people are staying up all night doing back of the envelope calculations, working out all the pledges. So
Like a
I'll say
half-time
thank
score,
you to
yeah.
Amber.
Thank you very much. I hope we have good news tomorrow and something to build up on.
And bye to you two.
Bye-bye, Adam. Have a marvellous second week in our home city, looking glorious, and the COP organisers waiting very nervously for when it's going to rain on all those people standing outside in queues for an hour and a half. But apparently they've bought lots and lots of brollies, I heard yesterday.
That is quite enough from two Glaswegians. Bye-bye. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.